Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Amazingly, the Obama administration still calls Yemen a template of success when it comes to its counterterrorism efforts. Closer to the truth is probably still another poorly thought out foreign policy adventure, and the double standards abound. What is deemed legitimate for Yemen is denied in the case of Ukraine. To cross-talk the conflict in Yemen, I'm joined by, among us, Marcus Papadopoulos in Moscow. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. Also with me is Mark Sleboda. He is an international affairs and security analyst. And in New York, we cross to Eric Draitser. He is a geopolitical analyst and founder of the website stopimperialism.org. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. Marcus Papadopoulos here. Let's talk about, first of all, the legitimacy issue here. We were told that the legitimate government in Yemen is residing now in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has gathered a coalition backed by the United States and its Western allies to return that president to Yemen. Legitimacy.
Well, there's complete double standards which are occurring at the moment in Yemen. The way that the American government and its allies in the region are behaving really serves as another example of the blatant hypocrisy and double standards of America. Because if, on the one hand, we take Yemen, we have a government which is engulfed at the moment by an opposition, an armed opposition, and the Americans and their Islamist ally in the region, Saudi Arabia, are backing the Yemeni government. On the other hand, if we go back to what happened in Ukraine at the end of 2013, the beginning of 2014, an identical situation. The Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian president, who was democratically elected and whose victory was recognized by the United States and the European Union, was faced with a very violent opposition. Now, someone that hasn't been on planet Earth for the last year and a half would probably think, well, the Americans and their allies backed Yanukovych in Ukraine and the Ukrainian government. Not so. What did they do? Not only did they recognise the opposition when they took power after Yanukovych was forced out, but they actually played the central role in bringing about that coup. So it's complete double standards, it's hypocrisy, and also, because it's in the Middle East, it's a very, very dangerous sign of the times.
Eric, if I go to you in New York, in the way you see it here, I mean, that's a story that Western media doesn't really want to touch very much, comparing Ukraine and Yemen. That's why I want to do it on this program here. I mean, what's it get down to is that the United States says do what we say, but don't listen to what we actually do on the ground?
Well, indeed, but let's examine this question of legitimacy, because how is legitimacy conferred? Is legitimacy conferred purely by winning an election? Well, if you take the example of Ukraine, and you had Yanukovych, who won a hotly contested election in Ukraine, one that was very close, one that was recognized as a democratic process. And then on the other hand, in 2012, you have the Yemeni president Hadi, who has recently been deposed. But Hadi was elected after having run unopposed and having been essentially installed by the United States. And remember that the Western media documented quite clearly, the New York Times quite extensively, the role of now CIA Director Brennan, at the time a special representative of the U.S. government in Yemen, how they managed a so-called democratic transition that put Hadi in place without any challengers. He essentially gathered 99% of the vote and is then presented to the world as a legitimate leader of the country. And so I would question the very nature of this issue of legitimacy. Who confers it, and what are the criteria that actually establish legitimacy? Because again, the hypocrisy is obvious vis-a-vis Yemen versus Ukraine. And then, of course, when we examine the deeper issues at play in Yemen, the U.S. and the Saudis and all of the rest of them, their strategic interests involved there, it becomes, I think, quite inescapable, the conclusion that legitimacy is really dependent upon interests, the interests of the main parties, not by any democratic process.
You know, Mark, I didn't really see any comment in Western mainstream media that this bombing of Yemen by Saudi Arabia and its allies is an act of war, and it is illegal under international law. It is not mentioned whatsoever. What should we draw from this here? Because, again, if we're using the comparison of Ukraine, I mean, given Western narrative, their narrative is that Russia is one that is causing instability in Ukraine, but Russia could have easily used its air force. It could have easily brought Mr. Yanukovych back in power, but it did not do that because that would have been acting illegally under international law.
Yeah, this is another case of the Western media really dropping the ball and showing their true colors by refusing even to write or acknowledge about the fact that this is a blatant act of aggression against another state. It is forbidden under international law that even if the West's accusations of Iranian involvement, which it has never presented an ounce of evidence towards, always vague statements about support or links. The proper method under international law would be to take this evidence to the Security Council, make their case, and there get a consensus among the members of the Security Council, the P5 nations, to somehow restore some degree of stability and representation to Yemen that doesn't involve achieving stability by the go-to U.S. method of bombing a country back into the Stone Age. And we shouldn't at all have any illusions, along with the 9 Arab states, some of them just token, that are providing assistance to Saudi Arabia. The United States is a full military partner in this adventure. They are providing intelligence, satellite data, refueling bombs. This is on top of the fact that the Saudi military is an entirely a U.S. creation. Obama just finished a $60 billion one-year arms deal, giving Saudi Arabia the fighters, the bombs that they're now using to bomb Yemen, and they trained them to use it.
Look at Marcus here. You know, ever since the end of the Cold War, we've seen one adventure after another in the Arab Middle East. And none of them, and I want to repeat, none of them have worked out well. And we're going to see it happen again. I mean, how do you explain this? Because the Saudis apparently think this is going to be a walk in the park. Now, anyone that thinks this is going to be a walk in the park and it's going to pay for itself, you know who I'm paraphrasing here, it's got to be out of their mind. But we keep seeing it happen over and over again. Marcus?
Well, I think we need to make to differentiate things here, because on the one hand, the wars in the Middle East and North Africa, they've been disastrous for the ordinary people living there. But on the other hand, Washington has achieved its objectives of gaining control over the oil fields there. So I think it's important to acknowledge that that is their objective. If you take Libya at the moment, the American and British embassies have fled. But of course, the oil and gas fields are still controlled by British, French and Italian companies. So they have won on that level. But I think also as well, I agree exactly with what Mark said. And I'd also add that isn't it a bit of an oxymoron at the moment with Saudi Arabia taking action in Yemen? Because the American government is projecting this image that Saudi Arabia is there to fight for the democratic government of Yemen. Okay. Saudi Arabia is the epitome
well, Marcus, you just stole the words out of my mouth. I want to go to Eric about that. Is that we don't hear a whole lot about saving the democratic process in Yemen. I mean, it must be a little tough for the people in the State Department, because that's always the hymn sheet that they pull out. It's kind of hard to play it. They're trying a little bit here because of legitimate government here. But when I think of Saudi Arabia, and I think most people that watch this program don't think of democracy very much.
Of course not, because Saudi Arabia really is one of the most oppressive states in the world. It is, not only is it an oppressive state, it has no democratic structures of any kind. I mean, we recently saw that quite clearly after the death of former King Abdullah and the transfer of power. We know exactly how the government of Saudi Arabia views not only democracy with utter contempt, but really any notions of a democratic process as we understand it in the West, or as anybody really around the world should understand it. So obviously they're not going to play the pure democracy card when it comes to Saudi Arabia, and you're quite right that they're playing the legitimacy card. But I want to return to this issue of the Western media, because if you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, or some of the other major Western outlets, you see essentially a partial picture of what's happening here. I mean, I have seen written in some of the mainstream media, you know, questions about a power struggle between Hadi and former President Saleh. All of that is true, but what they fail to provide is really a context for that, and they fail to give any glimpse into any of the other pieces of this puzzle. For instance, the very same New York Times documented in 2012 the vast presence of CIA operatives and military intelligence all throughout Yemen, ostensibly in the fight against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. All of those drone strikes, all of the military, the operations executed by the Yemeni military, all of that was coordinated by the CIA, by U.S. military intelligence, and others. And if you read the statements now coming out of the Obama administration, including the official statement from the spokesperson for the National Security Council, they are quite openly admitting they are providing the intelligence, the targeting capabilities, and many of the other things that Mark mentioned and that have already been brought up. The U.S. is playing the pivotal role in providing all of those things. So what the Western media is doing is, while on the one hand it's giving a partial view, it's totally distorting the fact that this is, at its very root, a U.S. operation. This operation could not be taking place without U.S. involvement. And so to present it as purely a Saudi operation, right, I think is really a misnomer and a distortion quite deliberately.
Okay, Mark, the White House still calls it a template of success. How can that possibly be?
They're calling this operation?
Still.
They're calling this operation a template. Okay, that is a new one on me. Yemen is a country. There are at least 5 or 6 factions fighting on the ground. Along with the Houthi movement, they are allied with southern Sunni secessionists, correct, not Shia. They are armed with leftists in the country.
It's a resistance movement.
The Ansar Allah movement is a broad-based, popular movement that has the support of nearly half the country. This is at the same time that we see that al-Qaeda is operating in Yemen, and they have a control over swaths of up to 1/3 of the country, and the Islamic State is starting to make inroads. What the Western media is not going to stress to you is that the biggest opponents of al-Qaeda in Yemen are the Houthi.
Okay, on that point, Mark, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Yemen. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the conflict in Yemen and Western media coverage of it. Okay, I'd like to go back to Eric in New York. Right before the break, Eric, you wanted to jump in and reacting to something what Mark had to say about the lay of the land, as it were, in Yemen. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. One point that has been systematically removed from the narrative, particularly in the West, I think, is the fact that Saudi Arabia has a number of varied interests in Yemen and reasons for why they're intervening. And I think one of the most interesting angles that is not being discussed is the fact that, and it's openly acknowledged all over the world, that Saudi Arabia provides the financing for many of those terror networks that are operating under the banner of al-Qaeda in Yemen. And they're trying to present this idea that Yemen was some kind of a functioning country under Hadi, when in fact it was essentially factionalized and al-Qaeda controlled much of the country. And Saudi Arabia should be seen in many ways as intervening not only on behalf of a puppet government in Hadi, but also on behalf of the networks, the al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula networks that they've been financing for years.
Okay, Marcus, let me go to you. I think what we just heard from Eric is really spot on there, because this is what, what's really happening on the ground. That is a narrative that is not talked much about in the Western mainstream. But what the Western mainstream does love to talk about is they look for the boogeyman, and the boogeyman in this case is Iran. The connection between the resistance movement in Yemen and Iran is tenuous at best. If there's evidence, we're not being shown it. But Iran is going to get the blame. It reminds me of Russia and Ukraine again. Go ahead.
Of course. The West, in order to convince its domestic audiences that it's right in a certain region of the world, it has to demonize a country. It has to demonize a government, demonize a leader. In the old Yugoslavia, who was demonized in the 1990s? The Serbs. If we go to Ukraine, who is being demonized? Russia and President Putin. If we take Yemen, of course, the West is now playing the Iran card. So ordinary people in the West watching this program really need to sit back and ask themselves, how many wars, how many bombing campaigns have Iran been involved in comparison to America, Britain and France? So they will keep on playing the Iranian card in Yemen in order to justify their stance on the country and to try and justify Saudi Arabia's stance. But as Eric correctly said, the irony is that Saudi Arabia is the leading exporter of religious extremism and terrorism to it. They're the ones that created Al-Qaeda during the Soviet-Afghan War.
And then if we take the context here, where it's the country Iran that is fighting ISIS more than any other country in the region, not getting virtually no credit whatsoever, because it's a shameful outcome, because this is on the back of the war in Iraq that was a failure. So you have Iraqis working with Iranians fighting ISIS that came about because of failed Western policy in the region. Those are a lot of thoughts to absorb. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. Let's put the dots together right now. Right now in Iraq, the U.S. is bombing in support of Iranian-backed Iraqi Shia militias that are trying to take Tikrit back from the Islamic State. While in Syria, the United States, while still ostensibly targeting this ISIS, is still insisting that the Alawite Shia secular government of Bashar al-Assad must go. Meanwhile, in Yemen, the U.S. is now bombing ostensibly Iranian-backed Shia militias against that are conducting a campaign of their own against ISIS. Now, these dots don't hatch together, and at the same time, Obama is very deep in P5+1 party negotiations to finally settle a nuclear peace deal with Iran. In the midst of all of this.
Okay, Eric, if I go to you, it seems to me, and I don't want to make too much light of this here, but everybody in the West, or at least in the corridors of power, are terrified that Iran might get the bomb. But listening to what Mark just said to us here, it looks like the U.S. just wants to bomb everybody in the region.
Indeed, and I would add to what Mark is saying. I mean, he's absolutely correct, but we have reports coming out from a number of those Shia militias in Iraq that the United States has been bombing both sides, that they're bombing ISIS and they're bombing them, and that they're essentially sowing the seeds of chaos and trying to kill as many people as they can, quite frankly. And I think that this is in keeping with a lot of what the U.S. strategy has been for quite some time, where you have these airdrops of weapons that supposedly mistakenly keep winding up in the hands of ISIS, all of these supposed Free Syrian Army factions that get their weapons from the U.S. and then immediately defect to ISIS or al-Nusra Front. So essentially there is this chaos, there is this drive to sow chaos as much as possible all throughout the region, and the United States has really been one of the main exporters of that strategy, of that policy. And so again, if you try to put it into the broadest context, you have this language, Iranian-backed or Russian-backed. What is the media trying to tell you? It's trying to tell you who is the bad guy, who is the good guy. Of course, they never say that President Hadi in Yemen is Saudi-backed. They never say the other side of that, and that's really part of the problem.
Marcus, you said something earlier, and it's something I've kind of grappled with on this program, because when we look at, is there a strategy, or is there just intentional chaos? Now, you've mentioned the intentional chaos theory, which I'm more and more coming around to, because if you look at it for the region, no matter what happens, whatever goes wrong, and it always goes wrong, you blame Iran. Israel likes it because it likes the chaos around it, because nobody focuses on it. I mean, Israel has to be over the moon right now, where it's working with Arab nations to attack another Arab country. That says quite a bit about what's going on with the Arab League here. So, but it is really chaos theory, and it works to the advantage of the West, Israel, and to Saudi Arabia, because it can play a lot of different cards, okay? But I don't see any positive outcomes.
I don't believe the West does have a strategy. What I believe it has is a long-term goal, and that long-term goal is preserving Western global dominance at any cost. And the West, going back to what Mark said about how there's contradictions about who the Americans are bombing at the moment in the Middle East. You know, if you look over the last 30 years, the Americans have worked with Islamists when it suited them.
Yep.
They've worked against them when it hasn't suited them. So during
it's overthrown democratically elected governments.
So during the Bosnian Civil War, who brought the Mujahideen to Europe? It was the Americans that facilitated their arrival from Afghanistan. They worked with them in order to destroy Yugoslavia, to prevent future Russian influence in the region. If we look in Mali, of course, the French are fighting against Islamist militants there because it doesn't suit them. In Syria, it makes absolute sense to team up with Islamists because they want to overthrow the Syrian government. If you overthrow the Syrian government, Russia loses all influence in the region, Iran will be severely weakened, and of course, Israel will lose one of its main adversaries.
But that's a great theory, and I see it playing out on the ground. But Mark, if I can go to you, in all of the cases that we heard from Marcos, this is empowering radicals, extremists, and I don't see one case of being able to turn them off. Once you let them loose, it's like, I hate to use it, but it's like toothpaste. Once you push it out of the tube, you never get it back in.
The genie or the devil is out of the bottle. So the U.S.'s only coherency in foreign policy throughout all of this maze of supporting Islamists in one country, against them in another, is a single standard. It is not a double standard. It is a single standard.
Some would say no standards.
No standards. Of pursuing a hegemonic U.S. foreign policy, not only in the Middle East, but across the world. But in the Middle East in particular, we see the entire region is now aflame. In Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Libya, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Tunisia's not much better off in this case. The common connector through almost all of these situations is U.S. interference, which invariably has either been military or military political interference in these countries. And the result of every one of this interference is the release of sectarian tensions and internal strife within that country, the rise of extremists on both sides quite often to power. But how does the U.S. seek to manage it? By doubling down and seeking to bomb stability back into them once
Eric,
again.
Is that a strategy, doubling down, and just keep kicking the can down the road? Because that's essentially what we're hearing from our guests here in Moscow.
Of course, it's not a strategy. What they're doing, though, the strategy really is to invert reality. It is to go on television and to present Iran as a supporter of extremism, as a supporter of terrorism, when in fact it is the United States and Saudis and its allies who have been sponsoring extremist groups that really see Iran as their ultimate enemy. And you see that in Iraq. You see that in the language that comes out of ISIS groups, in the language that comes out of Nusra Front, in the language that comes out of many of these extremist elements. Remember that the neocons, such as John McCain and others, they have held up so-called Iranian exiles, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, and a number of other terror organizations listed by the State Department as terror organizations. They have sponsored them, brought them to Washington to give presentations and so forth. There is a connection in all of this. It is to present Iran as the boogeyman in the Middle East. You see the language. They talk about Iran as an imperial power. I mean, think about the insanity of the United States. The United States and Saudis and all of the rest of these countries referring to the Iranians who have never waged an aggressive war, who
Eric,
were victimized by the puppet
here.
Saddam Hussein in the 1980s.
Let me jump in here, Marcus, and give you the last word here. Is this, to what degree is this to torpedo the Iranian nuclear talks? Is that a dot to be connected there, or the U.S. still would like to have a deal and they're going to continue with this this new operation?
Well, I think it's fair to say it's hardly conducive to bringing about a positive result to the talks. But I think undoubtedly it's just going to be played along and along. And will there be a resolution? I don't think so. I think Iran will keep on doing what it believes it's in its interest. The Americans will keep on demonizing Iran. And I think most importantly for the world is that Russia is back on the international scene, because if Russia was weak today, as it was in the 1990s, Syria would have been attacked by now, Iran would have been attacked by now. So it's very worrying what's happening in the world, but I do believe there's reason to be optimistic.
Okay, well, for a change, we ended this program on an optimistic note. I want to thank my guests here in Moscow and in New York, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
Sorry.
counterterrorism.